Thanks very much, Kerry, and thank you to VELG for the invitation to present at your first virtual VET summit. We're delighted to be involved. It's a great way to connect efficiently with the sector. And thank you all the people who are here and all those out virtual land for joining us for this session. So I'm going to talk hopefully for the next 45 minutes or until they gag me, and then the idea is that I'll leave 15 minutes at the end of my presentation for questions. That was a fulsome introduction, so I won't introduce myself again, other than to say one of my favourite roles at the moment is leading the wonderful folk at the USI office, and our role in many ways is to work with training providers and with states and territories and other stakeholders to support information flows around the training sector, hopefully to help students, employers, training providers, regulators and policy makers. Today I'm going to focus on talking about how we've gone with the implementation of the USI. Some of you may have seen some of the communications that occurred last year. They were all largely prospective. Now the rubber has hit the road, and mostly what we're going to be doing is reflecting on how it's going so far and the lessons we've learned from the last couple of months, in particular since the USI arrangements became formally applicable. So here's a bit of an outline of the presentation today. I always like to have a bit of an outline so that I can depart from it. But in addition to what we've got there, set a bit of an update on where the USI is at. The price of admission, unfortunately, is providing a bit of context about the USI and VET activity reporting. I'm also going to talk a little bit about exemptions. Of course, there were some updates to those late last year. Most RTOs have engaged with the USI successfully so far, but there are some who haven't. So for their benefit, we're going to touch on a sort of a Reader's Digest version of getting connected and getting ready, because it's not too late. But then the focus of the session is going to be about the lessons learned from the implementation so far, and a lot of tips for RTOs and their students. And then, as I said, we'll leave some time for questions. So the update is we're pretty sure that the USI system works because we've got over 1 million USIs that have been created so far. It's a student-centric system, so we were pleased that most of those USIs have been created by students, although a very considerable number have also been created by RTOs who have that option. As I said, thousands of RTOs are registered to connect to the USI using web services, which is effectively integrating the USI into their own student management system. That's by far the easiest way to do it if that option is available to you. But we also have many RTOs as well who are active in what's called the Training Organisation Portal, which is basically logging on using an internet connection to connect directly into the USI registry system. The good staff at the USI office are here to help training providers. The system works 24/7. It's been had probably the highest volumes it will ever have over the last month or so, and so far has been holding up well to that. There are, like all IT systems, it comes down for maintenance from time to time, and it's also probably important to mention that the connected databases through the document verification service, they also are run-off systems that have periodic outages, but it's always been very short so far, and so people are able to access that system any time of any day as a general rule. And we know that we have activity at 2 a.m. on Sunday mornings sometimes just keep it flowing. We have a number of support functions, even though it's a very simple and self-driven system, because it's new. We want to provide the highest level of service we can to people who are connecting with it. So we have the USI hotline that's open throughout the week, and we have a dedicated business operations team on the ground, the USI office, to help people. We've actually put on extra support teams to help RTOs and students over this peak period that coincides not only with the introduction of the USI, but the sort of the peak enrolment period, particularly for the public sector providers. They provide high level of support and guidance, fielding many queries through emails, phone calls, help requests, chat sessions, and basically most of what I'm going to be talking about today is the learnings that we've gained from gleaned from keeping track of those questions, queries and comments that come both from students and from training providers. So just a bit of context for those who may be new to the system. The USI is really part of a evolving training system and part of the Australian government's vet reform agenda. It's about freeing up information flows within the system and making sure that decision makers have that information available. The benefits from the USI that are linked to the USI, most prominent one is that it will provide students with access to their own training records throughout their lives, and regardless of which training provider is delivering that training. That's a benefit that will obviously mature over time as more and more training is entered into the system. Very strongly linked to that is that we think it will support many RTOs in their enrolment processes for their students around things like collecting evidence of prerequisite courses, credit transfers and RPL. It actually also can be supportive in terms of determining entitlements where students are in receipt of government subsidies, because previous training is often a consideration in relation to those. More broadly than that, it provides a fuller picture of training. The nature of the training sector is such that it is actually quite difficult to calculate the completion rates and know what students' pathways are through the systems. Not all students complete the training, the formal training course that they've enrolled to do, and that may be because they've exited with the training components that they required to meet their needs or to meet the needs of their employer. Having the USI along with total vet activity reporting is going to finally improve the ability to calculate things like completion rates, to follow student pathways, and those things will be very important to better targeting policy and programs into the future. Also supporting consistent national quality assurance and better targeting of those regulatory activities that make sure we keep the quality up in the sector. Rather than go through more detail on that, I'll just point people to some helpful resources that are available on our website that talk about those things in more detail, and they'll appear on the slideshow which will be available at the end of the presentation. As I mentioned, the USI is really a part, although an important part, of reporting requirements for the sector. It takes place in it is an important component of activity reporting and links to total vet activity reporting. It's just, in one sense, it is just one important field in the data return that training providers will be submitting each year, or more frequently if they have contract requirements that require it. TVA, Total Vet Activity Reporting, which is reporting by all registered training organisations, was actually introduced at the beginning of last year in 2004. The data collection reporting requirements apply to virtually all nationally recognised training. The requirement to be able to report has actually existed for a number of years. training organisations must report nationally recognised training delivered in 2014 by the end of February, so in 2 days, unless they have an approved exemption, or they've notified the regulator that they'll be taking advantage of the grace period that was available for 2014. In terms of where that information is to go, if you have fee-for-service only activity to report, it can go directly to NCVER, or that's the National Centre for Vocational Education Research, or to your state training authority, depending on the reporting arrangements in your state or territory. If you have government-funded only activity, you would submit that as you previously have usually through the state training authority. If you have a mixture of funded and unfunded activity, you should go to the NCVR website or contact your relevant state training authority as the arrangements vary from state to state. Your training information must be collected and reported to meet the VETMIS Vet Providers Collection specifications. NCVR has been supporting the rollout of total vet activity reporting, and they have a range of helpful resources to assist you in meeting your VETMIS reporting requirements, including frequently asked questions, fact sheets, a video tutorial and their own helpline. Just for those training organisations that were granted a 12-month grace period during 2014, you have to start collecting activity reporting from January, or had to, from January this year, 2015, and that will be reported normally in February 2016, or perhaps more regularly in the lead up to that if you have government funding. But please do have a look at the NCVR website for support on that. I said I'd mention briefly USI exemptions because there was an update to those towards the end of last year. You'll see there's a distinction between exemptions that apply to students and exemptions that apply to training organisations, and I'll detail those. In relation to the USI specifically, there are exemptions for students who completed all requirements for a VET award before or on 31st of December 2014, but may not have received that award in 2014. It's about the completion date for the training rather than the award date, which sometimes varies. International students who are studying offshore at an Australian registered training organisation are not required to have a USI. A key feature of the USI is the data integrity that is driven through the document verification service, which is linked to a range of Australian issued identity documents. Offshore international students don't have access to those documents, and so they're exempted from the USI requirement. Onshore international students, if you're delivering training to students in Australia, international students in Australia, they do require a USI, and they use primarily their visa and passport to establish the ID in relation to that. International students offshore, important to note that they are still part of the activity collection. They just don't need to have a USI. The last category of student exemptions relates to students who are granted an exemption by the Student Identifiers Registrar based on a genuine personal objection, and there is a process for them to do that. There's a balance between the benefits from the USI, which come from having collective access to information, and people's individual concerns for their privacy. If people have very strong feelings about that, they're able to complete a statutory declaration and request an exemption in that regard. If an RTO is presented with a certificate from the Student Identifiers Registrar saying that they have an individual exemption, then they don't have to collect a USI for that student, and when they're reporting, they'll be given a code to substitute for the USI in that case. Moving on to training organisation exemptions. As I said, USI is linked to training activity reporting, and there are a number of exemptions, a limited number of exemptions that apply to any reporting by particular types of training organisation. And where no training activity is reported, then there's no purpose to collect a USI in relation to that person's training. Those exemptions apply where data collection could jeopardise security or safety of defence, border protections, customs, national security or police personnel. And there's obviously a very limited range of organisations who are delivering that training. And data collections that conflict with the delivery of, is the important word, vital community services, including emergency, fire, rescue and first aid services. And I should point out in relation to that, although I don't have the detail in this slide, that relates to the training that's delivered by typically charitable organisations in those spaces to their volunteers. There was a clarification around the requirements in that exemption that says that commercial activity delivered by those organisations will actually need to be reported and consequently will have to have a USI associated with it. In terms of those organisational exemptions, we strongly encourage training providers to check with their regulator rather than assume that an exemption applies to them. Typically the regulators have a list of all the exempted training organisations on their website. So if you don't see yourself on that list, then an exemption probably doesn't apply at the moment and may not apply to you. An important thing where you're delivering training to students who have an exemption for some reason, maybe with the exception of international students studying offshore, is that you should inform students that their training won't appear on a USI transcript. That's to save the student and you headache down the track when they say, how come my transcript doesn't have the training delivered by training provider X? Sometimes it'll change their opinion about whether or not they supply USI to you. There's more information about exemptions on the USI website. Some of that was in several different places in earlier iterations last year, and we've tried to bring that together as much as we can on the USI website. If it's not directly there, there's a clear link to the detailed information around some of those there. Just want to mention briefly one last thing with the USI, which is there's a transitional arrangement which was approved by ministers, and that applies to short courses. That's courses of single day duration, i.e. you start the course and finish the course in a single day. For training activity undertaken before 1 January 2016, so this year, training organisations delivering single day courses will be permitted to issue a VET statement of attainment to students who have not been able to provide a USI before completion of training. A number of training providers in that space of single day training are accustomed to handing a certificate out at the end of the day. They have less time available to complete the USI processes with the student, and so ministers have agreed to allow, in those cases where a student is unable to provide a USI, for those organisations to still issue a certificate at the end of the training. But to sum up what they need to do, they should ask a student for a USI. If they're provided with one, they have to verify it, as other training providers would have to do. They have to record it and include it in their activity reporting, as other training providers would have to do. And if student's unable to provide a USI, then the training provider must inform the student that the training won't appear on the USI transcript. And the other tip we'd have for people who may qualify for this transition arrangement is to prepare their business processes for 2016 because this only applies for 2015. I just want to touch quickly on for those, as I said, most training organisations have established their connections to the USI system, and congratulations to all those who have. The implementation of the scheme would have been impossible without the cooperation of training providers, and the evidence that we have is that they, for the most part, training providers have really embraced the USI and come up with lots of innovative ways to incorporate it into their business. So well done, but we do still have some RTOs who haven't connected with us yet, and it's important that they do so as soon as possible. So those of you who might have seen the presentations last year might remember a slide that looked a bit like this. It's not a difficult process. You do it once and it all goes pretty smoothly from there. There is an access form. You establish your connection with us. You have to update your enrolment processes, prepare your staff in terms of procedures, and then empower your students. And I'll just touch on those points very briefly. There's where you find the access form. It's an online form available from our website. Looks a bit like that. When you go there, you have choices between connecting via our student management system, which is called Web Services, or directly via our website, which is helpfully called using the website. Sorry for the confusion between that. We can't think of another way to describe those. One day we will, perhaps. You can also use both. There may be training providers where some of your staff have access to your own student management system in some locations, but not in others. And you're welcome to use a mix of the web services connection and the training portal connection if you want to do that. The first key, and perhaps the thing that some training organisations stumble over, is getting an AUS key. In order for the system to recognise that you are the organisation who's permitted to undertake transactions through the USI registry system, we need to validate your identity. There's a whole of government verification service called AUS Keys, run by the Australian Business Register, and rather than create another one for the USI, we piggyback on this well-established process for businesses to interact with government, but it is run by the ABR rather than the USI office. Many training organisations already have an AUS key for purposes of doing their financial or tax transactions with the government, with the ATO. In many cases, the training people aren't aware of that because it's not a widely publicised thing. If you don't have one, it's a fairly simple process to get one. You go to the ABR website and basically follow the bouncing ball. A question that comes up a lot is, but what if I've got some people have access to the AUS key for financial transactions, but you're asking me now to give access to people to do training transactions in relation to students creating and verifying USIs, and I don't want those things mixed up. The system allows for that. There's a process called self-service authorization that basically lets you set the permissions that different members of staff have to use the AUS key to do different transactions with government, including the USI transactions. And again, that's provided, information on that is provided, fairly detailed information is provided on the ABR website. One of the tips someone reminded me of is you need to have your AUS key, your training code on TGA, training.gov.au, to connect to the USI system. On TGA, there's actually a combination of your training code and your ABN. If your ABN has changed, then it won't match up with your AUS key. So you may need to update training.gov.au with the current ABN or the ABN that you're using in relation to the AUS key in order to have that system work. Moving on I said that the next step is for people to update their enrolment processes. There's a couple of examples of how people have done that. You can do it on your paper form, as is the case on the left-hand side there, or on an electronic form, as a number of RTOs have these days. Probably the thing to mention is when you have the USI, you need to use the version of the person's name details, date of birth details, that has been used to create the USI in order to verify the USI and in order to report on that USI. It's good if they all match up, I guess, and I'll come back to that point a bit later on. Preparing your staff. The USI Office provides a number of support tools to help people with that. In the middle of the screen at the moment is an image from the little video that we have that introduces the USI for training providers and provides a bit of an explanation of how it works. It's not the detailed how-to guide. That's found in the item on the left, which is the user guide for RTOs. That's available online. You can print it off. You can copy and paste segments from it into your own documentation. It's designed so it can be accessed in small chunks. That's an excellent resource for people who will be doing USI functions within your training organisation. We also have fact sheets. They're actually videos, video tutorials on the key processes, creating, verifying and the like, and one of the benefits of those tutorials is they don't feature me. But there's a lot of material to help RTOs through the process, and again we have the helplines open and RTOs get priority service through those querying tools that we have available. Last thing I say is about empowering your students, which is basically about getting them to do the process as much as possible for themselves. The main way we contact students and tell them about the USI, because they won't be interested in it until they come to enrol, is through training organisations and the communications you have with your prospective and current students. So the more, most people, a lot of RTOs are linking to the USI directly from their website. Some have even incorporated it within their own enrolment process. It sort of ducks out and ducks back in immediately. You don't need to do that. I think if you just provide information about how to connect to it, students can find their way through from the USI website themselves most of the time. We also have videos, number of support materials. Again, you're free to use those in any way you want and however it suits your business processes to get your students aware and engaged. So there's an example of where it's been prominently displayed on the website for a training provider, very prominently displayed. CIT are our best friends. That's the process. I want to move now into basically tips from the experience of implementing the USI so far. As I said, we've had over 1 million USIs created. We've had an FAQ system that is displayed on the website for people who are driving themselves, and is also used by our call centre operatives to answer questions. We keep track of what questions get asked and how many times they get asked. It's actually a dynamic system on the website so that the most prominent questions go to the top. Now, having said that, the number one question on this list here isn't the number one question on the website at the moment, but the rest are. I was just going to quickly go through those and give people a quick idea of what the answers to those questions are, if it'll help. Now, the first one there is, I skipped some slides, is about how can I get additional Aus keys for my business? So the Aus key is basically your password to get into the USI system as a training provider. The answer to that question is pretty simple. We had a number of questions about getting over this first step from RTOs since we've turned the system on in October. That has probably motivated us and the ABR to improve the information that's available to people to get through that process, and we found now that there are less and less queries of that kind coming through. But one of the new ones that RTOs are sort of, as they're becoming more familiar with the system, is saying, how do I get additional Aus keys for additional staff? The answer is simple. Each training organisation will have an Aus key administrator, who's basically the chief Aus key holder for the person, the authoriser for the use of Aus keys in that organisation. As I said, sometimes your financial area. They log into the ABR website, and there's a menu on the left-hand side, it says, get additional OS keys, and you just follow the prompt and you can have as many OS keys as you want, the sort of subsidiary ones. Moving on to, so the rest of these questions are actually probably the consistent top 10 that we get people asking. My details match another USI, but I haven't applied for one yet. How come? That generally occurs because an RTO has created a USI on behalf of their student, either without the student's permission or with the student's permission, but there hasn't been a clear communication between them to say only one of us will create the USI and it's going to be me. So that's the general reason for that happening, and it's easy enough to resolve if we confirm whether the RTO is created on behalf of the student and then the USI holds. Sometimes we get two. The RTO and the student successfully create a USI for the same person each, and we reconcile those and one gets cancelled. I'll move on. I'll come back to that one because there's a bit more of that later on. How do I create a USI account? Students create their account just by accessing the USI website and selecting Create USI and following the prompts. If they can't access the internet, it's good if the RTO can assist them. They do have to have a form of ID to create their USI. There's a number of commonly held forms of ID: driver's licence, Medicare card, Australian passport, visas, birth certificates, certificates of registration by descent, citizenship certificates, and IMI cards. They're all valid IDs to use to create a USI. We know some people don't hold those, and in those cases we ask RTOs, if they have a large number of clients in that group, to help them by using a function called the DVS Override, and I'll talk a bit more about that later on. I cannot verify my form of ID. Typically that's because the students haven't entered the details in the system to exactly match what's on the form of ID. People have an understandable, strong attachment to the version of their name that they like to use. So even where they're using an ID that has an officially recognised version of their name, they'll often put the document details in, but then want to go with the version of their name that they like to use for themselves. So sometimes it's just that. Sometimes it's what the other function that this system is about to do is actually just human error. People miss key either their name or their birth date, which is why the system asks for it twice, and other details, and this system is deliberately helping that to be automatically checked for them. Okay. Often a second set of eyes, either a friend or an RTO staff member, will resolve that issue of a person who's not able to verify their ID. So sounds simple, but it does require attention, and one of the tips is people can't mix and match between their ID on the system and their ID that they want to use for themselves in general reference, and often it won't match. I'll come back to this. The version of a person's name that may already have been recorded by the RTO. There are a number of client relationship management systems now allow you to include several versions of a person's names, a preferred name as well as an official name. That's obviously an optimal solution in those cases. But if you can only have one, then we would strongly recommend that you use the officially recognised one, because it'll probably support the data integrity of the student management system of the RTO, as well as supporting the national consistent approach to people's ID. I've forgotten my USI, what can I do, is the next one. We expect people to forget their USIs. We hope they write them down and store them and can recall them, but when the USI is operating optimally, people will probably use their USI once or twice a year, so it's not unreasonable that people will forget them. The system is designed, like a lot of online systems now, to help people through that. There's a function called Forgotten USI for students to press on the system. They can enter a password and check questions, and they'll get the USI back. If they've forgotten their password, they can enter their USI and their check questions and get a new password. If they've forgotten everything, then they need to call through the USI office, and they'll be asked a number of searching questions that will help to verify their identity, and then we'll give them access to the system again. What does activating your USI account mean? Activation occurs when an RTO creates USI on behalf of a student, and what happens then is a message is automatically generated for the student, goes to the contact details that have been entered, and asks them to activate their USI account. That's because only the student can set their password and check questions for obvious reasons. They can also need to activate a USI that they haven't created themselves if they want to give the RTO permission to automatically access their online records, and that'll become a more valuable function when we turn on the transcript service next year. How can I change my personal details? So students can go in, log on to the system and change their personal details at any time. If they change the core personal details, they'll need to do it supported by one of the accepted forms of ID. How do training organisations verify a USI? So you need 3 things to verify USI, sort of, 4 things depending on how you want to do it. The USI, first name, last name, date of birth, right? So those fields are used to verify a USI. If they're wrong, the system will say you've got it wrong, and it'll tell you which one doesn't match, and you need to go back, talk to the student, and maybe update your records to get that USI through. We added down the bottom there, that's the curious one. So in a way it illustrates the fact that beyond those top questions, you start to get into quite particular issues that different subgroups of students have, and the New Zealand students one is a case in point. Our dear brethren across the ditch have special access to Australia, so they don't need a visa. They can use their passport to support their ID going through the USI process, but they can only do that when they've crossed the border into the country and Customs has registered their details from their New Zealand passport. So the answer, typically this question typically comes up when people are trying to pre-enrol before they've left New Zealand and come to Australia, and the answer is you'll need to do it when your feet are on the ground. USI, remember, importantly doesn't require that people have the USI before they enrol, only before they're issued with a statement of outcomes. Okay, moving on to top 10 tips for RTOs. The first one is relating to AUS keys. I was telling you about those before. You need to have an AUS key to access our system, whether it's by web services, i.e. through your student management system, or whether you're using a direct connection to our RTO portal. To get those, you go to ABR, the website's there, not the USI hotline, because we don't run that. If you're trying to access the training organisation login and ask for a password, the password it's looking for is your AUS key password. Again, go to our ABR friends for that. So that's at the beginning of the process. Okay, RTOs must use the training organisation login, not the student login. So we had a couple of cases where training organisations have been using the student login to create USIs. This is a big no-no. We've changed the text on the site to make this very clear to RTOs that that's not the way to do it. They have to use the RTO login, and they must not set passwords or check questions for their students. Number 4 tip, students can still enrol without a USI. We have not that many cases, but a few where both RTOs and students are getting a bit anxious about enrolling when they haven't been able to create a USI, but students can enrol without a USI. The legislation and the standards don't require a student to have a USI to enrol. The time that you do need a USI is when the RTO issues a qualification statement or a statement of attainment, or when you're reporting your EVETMIS data. whichever of those comes first. Fifth tip is about permission from students to apply for USI on their behalf. We said when we were introducing USI that it was up to RTOs to determine how they would capture student permission. We didn't want to be prescriptive about that. Probably the learning was that, and probably most people have a tick box to do that. What's probably a good lesson for everybody to take away is that just having the tick box, that's a good step, but it's probably good to be a bit more, sort of have an active conversation. Ask the student if they've created their own USI. If they have, then don't create one for them. If you're going to create one for them, see that they agree to that, and then be sure that they understand that they don't need to create one now because you're creating one on their behalf. And that'll get rid of a lot of problems, actually. There's a function on the, thank you, 15 minutes, good, we're going all right. There's a function on the RTO portal in the USI registry system that says find a USI. RTOs will not be able to use the find USI function unless the student's gone into their account and given the training organisation permission to view their data. So remember, an important principle behind the USI is the students control access to their data, to their training information. They can give electronic access to their training provider, but they have to do that actively from within the system. So the find function is there to help RTOs to search for records of students who've given them permission to see their records. So again, a tip that will be more useful as you go forward, if you think you will want to go back in and see a student's record, if you have an ongoing relationship with them, is to ask them to give you permission. Matching your student records to the USI to verify it. So I talked a bit about this previously. In order to verify, you obviously have to match the details, the core details that were used to create the USI. In some cases, RTOs don't have those, haven't duplicated those details in their system. It won't verify without using those details. It's up to you about whether you have two sets of name fields, for instance, for a person, and then sometimes there are strong justifications for doing that, for cultural appropriateness or the like. But you need to store the officially recognised version from the ID form as well in those cases. Sometimes students say, but I don't like that, my name as it appears on that form of ID. They can choose any of the other forms of ID if any of them reflect their name better, or they can change their ID, typically with the issuing authorities if they want to, but we can't mix and match. Having trouble with browsers. The USI system was tested with all the commonly used browsers and all the commonly used versions of the browsers, but there are literally hundreds, perhaps even thousands, and particularly if you count all of the different versions of each browser. So if you're having problems with one, we recommend trying another browser or updating your existing browser, and that will usually take care of that problem. 9's a bit of a generic one. If students are experiencing difficulties creating the USI, we'd encourage, it's meant to be a student-driven system primarily. We encourage RTOs to encourage their students to check the USI website first and see if they can help themselves. It has the questions to nearly all the answers to nearly all the questions that students ask, and will get most people through the system. A bit of support and guidance. I think I was saying to someone earlier today, if you're a staff member of an RTO and you've seen 10 students create a USI, that's 10 times more than most students will know about because they do it once. Right? So often just one person with a bit of advice looking over their shoulder will get them across the line. That's the quickest route for them to get a USI created. You don't have to create it on their behalf if they've had problems. I think just giving them kind of a bit of advice will probably get a large proportion over the line who are having problems. And if they're having repeated problems, you can request help from us as part of the login screen. Okay, some tips for students. There might be a bit of overlap in these, so I'll skip over the ones that are like that. USI already exists. That's that one where the RTO has created on their behalf and they've forgotten, or there hasn't been good communications. The tip is that the student should check with their training organisation to ask if that's the case and see whether they've given them permission. Again, the thing about names, got to use the names that appears on the ID. No mixing and matching. Changing personal details, same thing, they can update it. New Zealand students I've already talked about, and for RTOs we'd recommend they ask them to create USI once they've crossed the border. International students studying in Australia will generally be able to use their passport once they have their visa to come into Australia. That might be offshore, it might be at the point of entry. Help sessions for students, and that goes to that, thank you, that question I had, that suggestion I had this. You don't need to create, it's not a binary choice between making the student create their own sort of away from the RTO and doing a create for them. A number of RTOs we know do a USI Creation session as part of their kind of early induction to the training course. Commonly where the training is in foundation skills for students or people with poor English, it's actually a useful activity for them, a practical activity for engaging with government and organisations, create USI. A couple of quick ones. Some stats, I love stats. So the most commonly used form of ID for creating USIs is a driver's licence. It's quite a robust system, and it has the great advantage that many people are holding them. So more than half of all USIs are created using a driver's licence. Tips that for the things that can go wrong when using a driver's licence are that there's a driver's licence number and a document number. It's the driver's licence number that they have to use. We put a circle around it in the little picture that's on the site, but people still miss it sometimes. Second most commonly used one is Medicare card, again, because a lot of people are carrying it with them. Some of the same, I should say, the other issue with driver's licences, same with Medicare cards, is that they don't work if they're cancelled or suspended. With Medicare cards, you can have a new, even though the expiry date on a Medicare card is still in the future, people may have been issued with a new one, and the old one won't work once they've been issued a new one. So they're the most commonly used one. Most common, obviously, for international students is visa. Visas, in all databases, the match between database and the ID document isn't 100% perfect. So if people are at the tearing out their hair phase of trying to match the document, it's probably worth using the process to contact the USI office, and they'll be able to help with that. One of the things that, for instance, happens with visas is middle names. If you leave out the middle name, sometimes the visa will process. We don't try to make we don't encourage experimentation with that. In most cases, we'd ask people to call the office if they are matching the details on their ID document accurately and they're not getting USI. It's probably best to come through to us to resolve that. Okay, some final do's and don'ts. If this sounds a bit repetitive, but it'll help. RTOs shouldn't use the student login or set passwords or check questions. Please make sure you've got permission from students to create a USI on behalf and have that conversation that makes it clear who's going to create the USI. One I haven't talked about yet is that when you're creating a USI on behalf of students, you have to collect the details required to do that, i.e. the details, their personal details and the details from their form of ID that will be used. Don't create it from existing partial records. It won't work and it'll be picked up in deduplication typically. If you require a USI at the time of enrolment, and some RTOs do that, and in some cases it can be linked to eligibility for state territory funding, then please be clear about whose requirement it is to have the USI at the point of enrolment rather than later. Otherwise we get students calling us saying, the RTO says I have to have the USI at enrolment, why is the Commonwealth Government doing this? And we say the Commonwealth Government isn't doing this, and then there's an unpleasant conversation between the student and the RTO. But if you make it clear at the time, then there's no problem with that. DVS Override, so Document Verification Service Override. We've created a function that allows for the fact that there are some special categories of student who may have very limited access to the accepted forms of ID. Probably the most common case is people who are incarcerated. They don't have access to any forms of ID, and if you're delivering training to them, then we allow an RTO who is permissioned to use a DVS override function to create their USI without an ID form. In that case, what we're doing is substituting the automatic checking of the computer system for close scrutiny and attention to detail from the RTO. We're happy to do that, although we limit the numbers, and we'll be watching it carefully. We'll have to see how that works. If it turns out that RTOs in general or RTOs in specific aren't paying close attention when they're doing that, then the chances are that access to that function will be tightened or restricted. Two last things, I think they're the last things. Data matching duplication. So we have some people saying we can create more than one USI for a person. Does that mean your system is broken? The answer is no. The USI system is designed to improve the consistency in people's records and to prevent the inadvertent creation of duplicate identities, which is very easy, where people are studying with multiple organisations over different times in their life. It does that using the DVS ID system. It is not a 100-point identity check. If we made it that way, it would be a very big imposition on RTOs to do that. It uses one form of ID, and that's the idea, is that if people use the system correctly, then they'll get a consistent ID used across their training experience throughout their life, and their records will be joined up. If people try to create two USIs using two different forms of ID, and not all forms of ID have exactly the same details in them, that's acknowledged, then they can do that. However, in addition to the data matching that occurs automatically when people are creating USIs, and will block it and cause a resolution by scrutiny by the USI office, there'll be a deduplication process where we apply another more vigorous level of checking against those, and in some cases those will identify additional duplicate USIs and resolve them, in which case we'll have to tell the RTO and the student that has occurred. So it's more hassle, and you'll have to update your records. So it's better for everybody if people just apply the system as it's intended. Okay, I just finished on, so there's just about to go to questions, but what I've got up on the screen there are just a number of different ways. As I said, RTOs have been terrific in their uptake of the USI, and there's different number of RTOs, both public and private providers, ways they've incorporated information about the unique student identifier in their websites and in their business processes. How's that for timing? Okay, so now I throw to Kerry for questions.
Thanks, Jason. We have got a lot of questions here, but we won't have time to go through all of those.
Oh, okay. Hope they're all easy questions.
So I'll ask you some of the questions that we do have. Can an expired passport be used if it's the only ID a student has?
I think you'll find the answer is no. To that one, the person will have to find another form of ID.
Okay, straightforward question one. What do we do if a student does not want a USI and will not give permission to get one on his behalf?
Yep. Students who really don't want a USI are able to write to the Student Identifiers Registrar and request an exemption from having a USI. They do that they'll be asked to fill out a statutory declaration, have that attested to, send that in, and then they get a letter that says that they have an exemption, and then they present that to the RTO, and the RTO is able then to issue a certificate to that student without having USI. They'll also be given a code that they substitute for the USI in their national reporting in that case.
Got another one here. Will RTOs be required to put pre-2015 training results in the USI system?
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
So training completed after the 31st of December 2014 will need to be recorded with the USI against it as part of your activity reporting. Anything completed before that date doesn't have to have a USI associated with it. I just wanted to go back and say, just on that issue, because there are a number of people who thought that there'd be a lot of people objecting to having a USI, lots of students. So far, we've had less than 24 inquiries out of 1 million USIs created.
We'll have one last question. If a student gives our RTO a USI, do we need to have a signed written permission form from that student to use and verify the USI? Or do we only need to provide a privacy notice if we create it on their behalf?
Okay. If you create a USI on behalf of a student, then you must have their permission. I'd recommend that people have that recorded with a signature, perhaps as part of your enrolment form. If the student supplies the USI to you, then you don't have. Then your verification of that USI and your inclusion of the USI with your activity reporting does not require separate permission from the student. Excellent. And if you think it through, they've either volunteered it to you or they've given you a permission to create it on their behalf.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. We do have other questions, so we will talk to Jason about those questions a little bit later and get some responses for those sent out to you. Thank you very much for coming all the way from Canberra to speak to us today. We know that you're very, very busy, so it's very much appreciated, and I'm sure everyone's glad that they've been able to get some clarification on some of those issues. A lot of the questions that did come through, you actually answered throughout the presentation as well, so that was great. Thank you. So thank you, Jason.